The scent of wild rosemary and crushed lavender drifts on a warm breeze, carrying with it the salty tang of the Tyrrhenian Sea as it washes against the jagged granite cliffs of Corsica. It is late summer in the year 1769, and the island is a tapestry of deep greens and earthy browns, where the silver-leaved olive groves shimmer under a pale moon, and the air is thick with the hum of cicadas. In the small stone-walled town of Ajaccio, the streets are narrow and winding, holding the heat of the day long after the shadows have stretched across the Mediterranean. Here, in a house of modest nobility, a child is born who will one day redraw the maps of the world, but for now he is simply Napoleone, a small boy wrapped in the quiet embrace of a rugged, ancient land. His mother, Letizia Ramolino, is a woman of formidable strength and quiet dignity, possessing a beauty that is matched only by her iron soul. She is the true anchor of the Bonaparte family, moving through the halls of their home with a steady, rhythmic grace that instills a sense of order and duty in her children. As the young Napoleon grows, he watches her, absorbing the lessons of resilience and discipline that she carries like an invisible mantle. The Bonaparte heritage is one of survival and fierce pride, rooted in the craggy mountains and the dense maquis shrubland that covers the island, a landscape where every path is steep and every horizon is framed by the infinite blue of the sea. As you settle into your pillows and allow the weight of the day to fall away, perhaps you can imagine the sound of the wind whistling through those Corsican pines, a low and steady drone that lulls the mind into a state of deep tranquility. Before we journey further into the life of this young dreamer, I want to take a moment to welcome you. If you are settling in for the night and finding comfort in these stories, you are exactly where you need to be. Here at the Slumber Archives, we share new history narrations just like this one every single day, weaving the past into a tapestry of rest. If you find this journey relaxing, please consider subscribing so you never miss our nightly gatherings, and perhaps leave a like to help other weary travelers find their way to us. Now let us return to the quiet nights of a boy who felt the world was far larger than the island shores that contained him. The transition from the wild, sun-drenched freedom of Corsica to the cold, grey walls of the military school at Brienne-le-Château was a sharp and sudden shift for a boy of only 9 years. In the northern reaches of France, the air was damp and the skies were often heavy with clouds, a far cry from the vibrant light of the Mediterranean. Napoleon found himself an outsider, a young boy with a thick Italian accent and a name that sounded foreign to the ears of his aristocratic classmates. He was a creature of the mountains and the sea, thrust into a world of rigid formality and cold stone corridors. While the other boys played games in the courtyard, Napoleon often retreated into the stillness of the library, or found a secluded corner under a tree, where the only sound was the turning of a page. He was a solitary figure, wrapped in a coat that seemed a bit too large, his mind drifting far away from the taunts of his peers and the strict discipline of his tutors. In these quiet hours, he discovered the works of Plutarch, and the ancient world began to bloom in his imagination like a garden in the twilight. He read of Alexander the Great crossing the vast deserts of Asia, of Julius Caesar standing before the Rubicon, and of the stoic virtues of the Spartans. These were not merely stories to him, they were blueprints for a life yet to be lived. As the candles flickered and burned low in the dormitory, he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling and dreaming of marble columns and the thunder of hooves on distant plains. He felt a kinship with the heroes of old, a sense that destiny was something that could be carved out of the raw material of one's own will. The loneliness of being an outsider was not a burden, but a cocoon, a space where his ambitions could grow in the dark, undisturbed by the expectations of others. The nights in the military school were long and silent, punctuated only by the distant tolling of a bell or the soft footfalls of a watchman. During these hours, the young Napoleon practiced a kind of mental wandering, imagining the strategic layouts of ancient battles as if they were maps spread out across his bedsheets. He was learning the language of power and the rhythm of history, finding a strange comfort in the logic of geometry and the precision of mathematics. There was a certain peace in the certainty of numbers, a stark contrast to the shifting social tides of the school. He began to see the world as a series of heights to be scaled, each book a step toward a summit that only he could see. The rugged landscapes of his childhood had given him a heart of stone and fire, and the isolation of his schooling was tempering that heart into a blade, sharp and ready for the years to come. As the seasons turned and the years passed, the boy from Corsica began to blend into the fabric of the French military system, yet he never truly belonged to it. He remained a visitor from a different time, a soul nourished by the salt air of the Mediterranean and the grand visions of antiquity. He would often think of the olive groves of his home, the way the light filtered through the leaves in the late afternoon, creating a mosaic of gold and shadow on the ground. He remembered the steady voice of his mother, telling him that a man's worth was measured by his endurance and his loyalty to his blood. These memories were like anchors, keeping him steady even as the winds of revolution began to stir in the distance, promising a world where the old rules would no longer apply. In the deep stillness of the night, when the rest of the school was lost in sleep, Napoleon would sometimes stand by the window and look out at the stars, wondering if the same constellations were watching over the cliffs of Ajaccio. The universe seemed vast and indifferent, yet he felt a strange pull toward the horizon, a restlessness that could only be stilled by the pursuit of greatness. He was a student of the past, but his eyes were fixed firmly on the future. He was a boy who walked with ghosts of emperors and philosophers, finding in their company a solace that the living could not provide. And so, in the quiet cradle of the Mediterranean and the cold halls of Brienne, the foundations were laid for a life that would shake the very foundations of the earth, all while the world slept, unaware of the storm that was beginning to gather in the heart of a lonely, dreaming boy. The heavy, iron scent of gunpowder begins to drift across the harbour of Toulon, mingling with the salt spray of the Mediterranean. It is the year 1793, and the young officer, once a solitary boy in the halls of Brienne, now finds himself standing upon the rugged cliffs of the southern coast. The Republic is in peril, its borders pressed by kings and its internal peace shattered by rebellion. Below the heights, the British fleet sits like a cluster of dark, watchful ghosts upon the water, their masts swaying gently with the tide. Napoleon, now a captain of artillery, looks down upon the scene not with fear, but with the cold, calculating eye of a master weaver at a loom. He sees the geometry of the landscape, the way the jagged promontories command the waves, and he realizes that the key to the city lies not in a frontal assault, but in the silent language of trajectory and position. He works tirelessly through the damp nights, his boots caked in red mud, moving cannons with a quiet intensity that begins to draw the eyes of his superiors. He is thin, almost gaunt, with long unpowdered hair that falls over his brow, but his voice carries a new, grounded authority. When he finally opens fire from the heights of L'Aiguillette, the red-hot shot rains down upon the enemy ships, turning the harbour into a cauldron of light and shadow. The British are forced to retreat, their sails catching the wind as they flee into the darkness of the open sea. In the aftermath of the smoke and the shouting, the name of the young Corsican begins to echo through the halls of Paris. He is promoted to brigadier general at the age of only 24, a meteor streaking across the turbulent sky of the Revolution. But the winds of fortune in France are as fickle as the autumn leaves. As the reign of terror fades into the complex, shifting politics of the Directory, Napoleon finds himself briefly sidelined, walking the streets of Paris as a man with a prestigious title but very little coin in his pockets. He is a skinny officer in a faded uniform, wandering the gardens of the Tuileries, watching the fashionable crowds and feeling like an outsider in the very city he is destined to rule. He spends his evenings in quiet cafes, nursing a single cup of coffee, his mind constantly turning over maps and maneuvers. He is waiting for a moment, a single opening in the fabric of history through which he might step. That moment arrives on a crisp October day in 1795, a date known to history as the 13th of Vendémiaire. The city is in an uproar, with royalist insurgents marching toward the seat of government, their footsteps drumming a rhythm of counter-revolution. The Directory is paralyzed by indecision, but Napoleon does not hesitate. He understands that order is not maintained by gentle words, but by the swift, decisive application of force. He clears the streets with what he later describes as a whiff of grape-shot, the thunder of his cannons echoing through the narrow alleys and over the cobblestones. In a few hours of clinical, terrifying efficiency, the rebellion is quelled. The skinny officer is no longer a ghost in the gardens. He is the saviour of the government, the man who held the line when all others wavered. As his political importance rises, so too does his presence in the glittering salons of the Parisian elite. It is here, amidst the soft glow of candlelight and the rustle of silk, that he first encounters Marie-Joseph Rose de Beauharnais. She is a woman of grace and mystery, a widow of the guillotine who has survived the terrors of the Revolution with her charm intact. To the world, she is a socialite of the Directory. To Napoleon, she becomes an obsession. He is fascinated by her effortless elegance, her voice which sounds like the gentle stirring of leaves, and the way she seems to hold the wisdom of 1,000 years in her dark, almond-shaped eyes. He is a man of fire and mathematics, yet in her presence he becomes a poet. He renames her Josephine, a name that belongs only to him, and he pursues her with the same relentless focus he applies to a battlefield. Their meeting is a collision of two different worlds, the rugged, ambitious soldier from the provinces and the refined, aristocratic woman of the capital. Despite the warnings of his family and the whispers of the courts, he is captivated. In the quiet moments before sleep, he writes her letters filled with a raw, unshielded passion, his handwriting a jagged scrawl that mirrors the intensity of his heart. He sees in her a partner for the journey he is about to undertake, a calm harbour for his restless spirit. The transition from the skinny, awkward officer to the respected general of the interior happens almost overnight. He begins to carry himself with a different weight, his shoulders squared against the burdens of command. The world starts to see him not as a Corsican upstart, but as a man of destiny. He is given command of the army of Italy, a force that is, at the time, little more than a collection of ragged, hungry, and demoralized men. Many of the older generals look at this young man, barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, with skepticism. They see his small frame and his pale face, and they doubt his strength. But Napoleon possesses a magnetism that transcends physical stature. When he arrives at the front, he does not speak to his soldiers of abstract ideals or complex philosophies. Instead, he speaks to their pride, their hunger, and their desire for glory. He promises them that he will lead them into the most fertile plains in the world, where honor and riches await. His eyes, which some describe as being the colour of the sea before a storm, seem to look through the men, seeing the heroes they could become rather than the wretches they currently are. As he prepares to cross the Alps, the image of the dreaming boy from the olive groves of Ajaccio begins to fade, replaced by the silhouette of a commander who will soon redraw the map of Europe. He is no longer walking with the ghosts of the past, he is becoming one of them. The air around him seems to hum with a new energy, a quiet vibration of power that draws people into his orbit. Even in the stillness of the night, as he pores over his charts by the flickering light of a camp lantern, there is a sense of inevitable momentum. He marries Josephine in a hurried civil ceremony in March of 1796, just days before he must depart for the Italian campaign. He leaves behind the warmth of her bed for the cold, thin air of the mountains, carrying a miniature portrait of her tucked against his chest. As he rides toward the horizon, the transition is complete. The Republic has found its sword, and the world is about to learn that the most dangerous man is the one who has spent his youth dreaming of greatness in the silence of a library. The army begins its march, a long winding dragon of blue and steel snaking through the mountain passes. The soldiers find themselves moving at a pace they have never known, driven by the restless will of their general. Napoleon is everywhere at once, checking boots, inspecting rations, and studying the terrain with a focus that borders on the supernatural. He is teaching his men a new way of war, one based on speed, surprise, and the absolute concentration of force. The old rules of engagement, the slow and stately dances of 18th century warfare, are about to be swept away by a hurricane of modern ambition. In the quiet hours of the march, when the only sounds are the rhythmic thud of boots and the creak of wagon wheels, Napoleon finds a strange peace. The chaos of the battlefield is, for him, a form of clarity. While others see confusion, he sees patterns. While others feel fear, he feels the cold exhilaration of a grand game being played for the highest stakes. He is no longer the lonely child looking out at the sea. He is the master of the tides, and the shores of Italy are waiting for the first wave to break. As the stars hang low over the snow-capped peaks, the young general contemplates the path ahead. He knows that his rise has been swift, but he also knows that the higher one climbs, the more precarious the footing becomes. Yet there is no hesitation in his stride. He has spent his life preparing for this moment, building a fortress of knowledge and will within his own mind. The Republic is watching, Josephine is waiting, and the history books are holding their breath, ready to record the deeds of the man who turned a whiff of grape shot into a crown of laurels. The night is deep, the air is cold, and the world continues to turn, unaware that the dawn will bring a change that will last for 1,000 years. The weight of a heavy silk map, worn at the edges and smelling faintly of ink and old parchment, feels like the weight of destiny itself as it is unrolled across a makeshift wooden table. It is the spring of 1796, and the young General Bonaparte is no longer a dreamer in a library, but a commander in the field, leading the army of Italy across the jagged, snow-capped spines of the Alps. There is a rhythmic, almost hypnotic quality to the movement of these men, the steady crunch of boots on frozen earth, the rhythmic jingle of horse tack, and the low rolling rumble of wagon wheels echoing through the narrow mountain passes. Unlike the lumbering armies of old, this force moves with a startling, fluid grace, slipping through the high altitudes like a mountain stream, finding the path of least resistance. Napoleon does not just lead them, he breathes with them, his mind calculating distances and calories, terrain and timing, with a precision that borders on the musical. He promises them honor and riches, but more than that, he gives them a sense of purpose that warms them better than any campfire. As they descend into the lush green plains of Lombardy, the air grows softer, smelling of damp earth and blooming jasmine, a stark contrast to the biting cold of the peaks. It is here, at the Bridge of Lodi, that the soldier becomes a legend. The scene is one of chaotic energy. The smoke from the Austrian cannons hangs thick and white over the Adda River, obscuring the sun and turning the afternoon into a ghostly twilight. The bridge is a narrow ribbon of peril, but Napoleon is there, in the thick of the haze, positioning the guns himself, his eyes sharp and focused amidst the whistling air. In this moment, the soldiers see not just a general, but one of their own, a man willing to stand in the path of the storm. It is here that they affectionately dub him the Little Corporal, a title of endearment that binds the hearts of the rank and file to his own. He realizes then, as the bridge is swept and the enemy retreats, that he is a man of destiny, a chosen child of fortune who can no longer be contained, by the simple borders of his past. The Italian campaign becomes a whirlwind of movement, a series of rapid-fire victories that feel like a dream of perpetual motion. The cities of Milan and Mantua fall like overripe fruit into his hands, and with every victory, the young general sends back crates of art and gold to Paris, filling the coffers of the Republic and the galleries of the Louvre. Yet even as he stands amidst the marble splendors of Italy, his gaze begins to wander further east, toward the rising sun and the ancient mysteries of the Orient. The Mediterranean Sea is a vast, shimmering mirror of turquoise and deep sapphire as the French fleet sets sail for Egypt in the summer of 1798. This is not merely an invasion. It is a grand scientific and philosophical pilgrimage. Along with 35,000 soldiers, Napoleon has brought a small army of 160 savants, astronomers, mathematicians, naturalists, and artists, all tasked with uncovering the secrets of a land that has been shrouded in myth for millennia. As the ships glide across the water, the nights are spent in quiet contemplation on the decks, the scholars discussing the stars and the ancient world, while the waves lap gently against the wooden hulls. Napoleon himself moves among them, his mind a sponge for their knowledge, envisioning himself in the footsteps of Alexander the Great and Caesar, walking where the gods once walked. When they finally arrive, the heat of the Egyptian desert is a physical weight, a dry, searing golden haze that stretches toward an infinite horizon. The sand, fine as powdered silk, shifts beneath their feet, whispering secrets of forgotten dynasties. At the Battle of the Pyramids, the French army forms massive, unyielding squares of bayonets against the charging Mameluke cavalry. Napoleon stands before the Great Pyramid of Giza, its massive limestone blocks glowing amber in the afternoon light, and utters the words that would echo through the ages. Soldiers, from the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you. The scale of the monuments is humbling, their silent, weathered faces watching as the modern world clashes with the ancient. Amidst the thunder of cannons and the shouts of men, the Sphinx remains unmoved, its stony gaze fixed on a point far beyond the horizon of human ambition. While the soldiers fight, the savants wander through the ruins of Thebes and Luxor, their charcoal pencils scratching softly against paper as they sketch the outlines of fallen obelisks and lotus-crowned columns. The air inside the ancient tombs is cool and still, smelling of dust and the very essence of time itself. It is during this period of exploration, in the small town of Reshaped, or Rosetta, that a French officer notices a peculiar slab of granodiorite being used in the construction of a fort. This stone, inscribed with 3 different scripts, Greek, Demotic, and the mysterious, bird-like symbols of the hieroglyphs, becomes the key to a door that has been locked for 2,000 years. In the quiet of the desert night, by the flickering light of an oil lamp, the realization begins to dawn that the silent stones of Egypt might finally be made to speak. The Egyptian dream is one of immense beauty and profound isolation. As the sun sets over the Nile, the river turns to liquid copper, and the palm trees cast long, spindly shadows across the dunes. Napoleon often sits alone in his tent, the flaps open to the desert breeze, reading the works of the great historians, and writing long, passionate letters to Josephine, his words filled with a longing for the cool gardens of Malmaison. The campaign is difficult, the plague thins the ranks, and the British fleet under Nelson cuts off their retreat, leaving the army stranded in a land of gold and dust. Yet even in the face of these hardships, the intellectual harvest of the expedition is unparalleled. They are cataloguing a world, mapping the stars from the roof of the Temple of Dendera, and recording the flora and fauna of the Nile with a devotion that transcends the violence of war. As the months turn into a year, the allure of the East begins to mingle with the cold realities of European politics. News reaches Napoleon of turmoil in Paris, of a government failing and a nation calling for a savior. The desert, for all its mystical beauty, is a cage of sand. And so, under the cover of a moonless night in August of 1799, he boards a small frigate, leaving his army behind to navigate the Mediterranean like a ghost. The ship slips through the British blockade, the sails snapping softly in the wind, the salt spray cooling the heat of the Egyptian sun from his skin. He is returning to a France that is weary of chaos, a nation waiting for the firm hand of the man who conquered the Alps and stood in the shadow of the pharaohs. The Italian and Egyptian dreams have forged him into something more than a general. They have made him a symbol of the Enlightenment's ambition and the Romantic's soul, a man who believes that the world is a map waiting to be redrawn in his image. The journey home is long and quiet, the rhythm of the waves a soothing balm to a mind that never rests. He watches the stars, the same stars that guided the ancient navigators, and feels the pull of the future. The Republic is a fragile thing, a flickering candle in a dark room, and he intends to be the one who guards the flame. Behind him, the Rosetta Stone is being crated for a journey of its own, and the little corporal is maturing into the first consul. The history of the world is about to shift its axis, turning away from the ancient sands and toward the gilded halls of Paris, where a new era is waiting to be born from the smoke of the battlefield and the silence of the desert night. The world continues to turn. The tides rise and fall against the shores of France, and the man who would be emperor closes his eyes for a brief, rare moment of sleep, dreaming of the crowns and the crosses that lie just beyond the horizon. The scratch of a quill across heavy parchment becomes the new rhythmic heartbeat of France, replacing the thunderous drumbeats of the Revolutionary Guard. As the 18th century gives way to the 19th, the chaos of the past decade begins to settle like dust after a great storm, and in the quiet rooms of the Tuileries Palace, Napoleon Bonaparte sets himself to the task of building a nation that can last for 1,000 years. He is no longer just a general of the army, he is the first consul, the architect of a new order, and he moves through the halls of power with a quiet, restless energy, his mind constantly turning over the gears of law, religion, and civil life. The streets of Paris, once slick with the reins of uncertainty, begin to feel the weight of a different kind of stability, a sense that the world is finally being pulled back into its proper orbit. He understands that a country cannot live on glory alone, and so he gathers the finest legal minds of the age to sit in long, candlelit sessions, debating the very nature of justice and property. The result of these quiet nights is the Napoleonic Code, a massive undertaking that seeks to replace a tangled web of ancient feudal customs with a single clear set of laws. Imagine the smell of old ink and the soft rustle of paper as thousands of pages are turned. This code is designed to be simple, logical, and universal, ensuring that every citizen, from the vine grower in the south to the merchant in the north, understands their rights and their duties. It is a legacy that will outlive any empire, spreading its roots deep into the soil of Europe and beyond, long after the cannons have fallen silent. Under this new law, the family becomes the foundational unit of the state, and the concept of merit begins to replace the old accidents of birth, creating a society where a man's worth is measured by his talent and his service rather than the titles of his ancestors. While the lawyers work in their studies, Napoleon turns his gaze toward the spiritual heart of the nation. For years, the bells of the great cathedrals had been silent, or rung only for secular celebrations, as the Revolution had fractured the relationship between France and the Church. But Napoleon knows that a people needs its traditions, its rituals, and its sense of the eternal to feel truly at peace. In the year 1801, he signs the Concordat with the Pope, a delicate and masterful piece of diplomacy that restores the Catholic Church to its place in French life, while ensuring the state remains the ultimate authority. On the morning the agreement is announced, the great bells of Notre Dame ring out across the Seine for the first time in years, their deep bronze voices vibrating through the cool morning air and echoing off the stone facades of the city. People stop in the streets to listen, the sound a physical manifestation of a world returning to its senses, a bridge built between the radical dreams of the past and the steady foundations of the future. As the months turn into years, the consulate transforms France into a hive of orderly activity. New roads are carved through the countryside, straight as an arrow, lined with poplars to shade the marching troops and the travelling merchants. Canals are dug, bridges are mended, and the grand facades of Paris are cleaned and restored to their former lustre. There is a sense of momentum, a feeling that the nation is a great ship that has finally found a steady wind. Napoleon himself seems to be everywhere at once, overseeing the creation of the Bank of France, the establishment of the Lycée to educate the next generation, and the founding of the Legion of Honor to reward those who serve the state with distinction. He works late into the night, the glow of his lamp visible from the courtyard, a solitary figure weaving the threads of a new civilization. The air in Paris during the autumn of 1804 is crisp and expectant, filled with the scent of wood smoke and the lingering sweetness of fallen leaves. The city is preparing for a moment of such theatre and scale that it will be remembered for centuries. On the 2nd of December, the frost clings to the gargoyles of Notre Dame, and the interior of the cathedral is transformed into a sanctuary of crimson and gold. Thousands of candles flicker in the vast dim space, casting long shadows against the ancient stone pillars. The air is thick with the fragrance of incense and the heavy floral perfume of the gathered nobility, who wait in hushed anticipation, their silks and furs rustling like the sea. The procession is a slow, majestic river of colour moving through the streets. Napoleon arrives not as a conqueror on a horse, but as a sovereign in a carriage of glass and gold, drawn by 8 white horses. He is dressed in a long mantle of purple velvet, embroidered with golden bees, an ancient symbol of the French kings, and lined with the purest white ermine. As he enters the cathedral, the music of a massive orchestra and a choir of 500 voices swells, filling the vaulted ceiling until the very air seems to shimmer with sound. The Pope is there, seated on a high throne, waiting to bestow his blessing on this new era. But in a moment that defines his character and his reign, when the time comes for the crown to be placed upon his head, Napoleon takes it with his own hands. He turns his back to the altar and faces the congregation, his movements slow and deliberate, and he places the golden laurel wreath upon his own brow. It is a silent declaration that he owes his power to no one but himself and the people of France. Then he turns to Josephine, who kneels before him in a gown of silver tissue and white satin, her face pale and beautiful in the candlelight. He gently places a smaller crown upon her head, a gesture of tenderness amidst the immense gravity of the ceremony. The light catches the diamonds in her hair, sending flashes of brilliance dancing across the walls. Outside, the cannons roar in a rhythmic salute, the sound vibrating in the chests of the thousands who have gathered in the cold to witness the birth of an empire. The world has watched a soldier from a small island become the emperor of the French, a transformation so complete that it feels like a dream of antiquity brought to life in the heart of the modern world. As the celebrations spill out into the night, with fireworks blooming like fiery flowers over the Seine, the new emperor sits in the quiet of his chambers. The heavy crown has been set aside, the velvet mantle draped over a chair, and the silence of the palace returns. He has achieved the impossible, bringing order to the storm and a throne to the Republic. The legal codes are written, the churches are open, and the map of Europe is being redrawn by his hand. But even in this moment of ultimate triumph,
there is a sense of the vastness of the journey still ahead. The peace he has built is a fragile thing, held together by the strength of his will and the sharpness of his mind. The fire in the hearth crackles softly, casting a warm orange glow over the maps spread across his desk. The borders of nations seem fluid in the flickering light, shifting and changing as he contemplates the horizons yet to be reached. France is now his to command, a masterpiece he has painted with the broad strokes of reform and the fine details of administration. The streets of Paris are quiet now, the citizens sleeping under the protection of his laws, their dreams perhaps filled with the same visions of glory that haunt his own. The night is deep and still, the only sound the occasional hoof-beat of a sentry's horse on the cobblestones outside. The architect of modern France has finished his work for the day, and as the candles burn low, the weight of the empire rests gently upon the silence of the room. The transition from the old world to the new is complete, and the man who remade the law now waits for the dawn, when the sun will rise on a landscape forever changed by his hand.
The scent of damp wool and wood smoke hangs in the crisp morning air of December, 1805, as a thick blanket of fog clings to the valley floors of Moravia. It is a silence so profound that one can almost hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of thousands of men waiting in the shadows of the Pratzen heights. Napoleon stands upon a small rise, his grey overcoat buttoned against the chill, watching as the mist begins to swirl and thin. He has lured his enemies into a trap of his own making, feigning weakness to invite an attack, and now, as the golden orb of the sun finally pierces through the grey haze, it illuminates a landscape destined for legend. This is the sun of Austerlitz, a light that seems to radiate not just from the sky, but from the very centre of his destiny. With a quiet command, the French columns emerge from the fog like ghosts taking form, striking the centre of the Allied lines with a precision that feels less like a battle and more like a carefully choreographed dance of iron and fire. By the time the afternoon shadows begin to lengthen over the frozen ponds, the Third Coalition has dissolved into the winter air, and the map of the world has been irrevocably tilted toward Paris. This victory at Austerlitz is the masterpiece of his career, a tactical symphony played out on a grand scale, yet it is in the quiet aftermath that the true scope of his power begins to settle over the continent. As the years of the early 19th century unfold, the borders of Europe seem to soften and flow like wax beneath his signet ring. He becomes a cartographer of kingdoms, sketching new nations into existence with a stroke of his pen and a flick of his wrist. Old dynasties that had stood for 1,000 years find themselves fading into the margins of history, replaced by a new order of his own design. He creates the Confederation of the Rhine, bringing a sense of unity to the fragmented German lands, and he places his own brothers upon the thrones of Naples, Holland, and Westphalia. It is a time of immense, quiet reorganization, a period where the clatter of the printing press and the scratching of the quill are just as loud as the roar of the cannons. Imagine, if you will, the daily life of this man as he moves across this changing landscape, living not in the gilded palaces of his conquered capitals, but within the rhythmic, predictable confines of his travelling tent. Even in the heart of a campaign, Napoleon maintains a sanctuary of order and meticulous habit that provides a steady pulse to his whirlwind existence. The tent is a marvel of efficiency, lined with blue and white striped silk, smelling faintly of lavender and the high-quality leather of his dispatch cases. There is a folding mahogany desk, a narrow camp bed with green silk curtains, and a small table where his maps are spread out, those vast ink-stained sheets that represent the physical reality of his dreams. He moves through his day with a quiet, restless energy, dictating hundreds of letters to a small army of secretaries who struggle to keep pace with the rapid-fire delivery of his thoughts. He eats quickly, often in silence, Favouring simple meals of roasted chicken or a few pieces of bread and cheese, his mind always 3 steps ahead of the current moment, calculating the logistics of a march or the nuances of a diplomatic treaty. The zenith of this diplomatic power is perhaps most vividly felt on a warm afternoon in June, 1807, upon the calm waters of the Niemen River. There, at the town of Tilsit, a magnificent raft has been constructed, moored in the very centre of the current to represent a neutral space between east and west. It is decorated with eagles and lush fabrics, a floating stage for a meeting that will decide the fate of millions. Napoleon waits upon the timbered platform as the young Tsar Alexander I of Russia approaches in a small boat. When they meet, there are no shots fired, no cries of war. Only the soft lapping of the river against the logs and the polite murmurs of 2 men who hold the world in their hands. They embrace like brothers, and for 2 weeks they share meals, review troops, and talk late into the night about the future of a divided globe. At Tilsit, Napoleon is no longer just a general or an emperor. He is an arbiter of the human story, a figure so central to the age that even his enemies find themselves drawn into the orbit of his charisma. As he sits in his tent during these long summer nights, the scratching of his pen is the only sound against the canvas walls. He is mapping a new Europe, one governed by the principles he carried out of the Revolution: merit over birth, law over whim, and a systematic efficiency that seeks to sweep away the cobwebs of the medieval past. He dreams of a unified legal code that stretches from the Atlantic to the Vistula, a common currency, and a network of roads that will allow ideas and commerce to flow as freely as his armies once did. He views the continent as a great puzzle to be solved, a series of interlocking pieces that, if placed correctly, will create a lasting peace under the eagle's wing. The kingdoms he creates are not merely spoils of war, but laboratories for his reforms, where the old feudal dues are abolished and the light of the Enlightenment is filtered through the lens of French administration. There is a strange, meditative quality to this period of his life, a sense of being at the very centre of a turning wheel. While the world outside is in a state of constant flux, his inner world remains governed by a strict, almost monastic devotion to work. He sleeps in short bursts, waking in the middle of the night to read reports by candlelight, his shadow dancing long and thin against the silk walls of his tent. He finds a peculiar comfort in the details. The number of shoes in a warehouse in Mainz, the exact depth of a river in Poland, the temperament of a local magistrate in a small Italian town. To him, the empire is a living organism, and he is its heartbeat, pulsing with a constant stream of information and instruction. This meticulous attention to detail is what allows him to hold so many threads at once without letting a single one slip through his fingers. And so, the map of Europe continues to shift and settle into new shapes. The Holy Roman Empire, a relic of a bygone age, is formally dissolved, its ancient titles vanishing like smoke. In its place, the new kingdoms rise, their borders drawn with a precision that defies the messy history of the land. Napoleon moves through these new territories with the calm assurance of a master builder surveying a finished structure. He visits the construction sites of new bridges, walks the halls of newly founded universities, and stands in the quiet of ancient cathedrals, his presence a bridge between the old world and the new. The air of Europe feels charged with a different energy, a sense that the old boundaries of what was possible have been permanently expanded. As the night deepens over the camp and the fires of the Grand Army burn low, Napoleon finally sets down his pen. The tent is cool now, the silence of the countryside pressing in against the fabric. He steps outside for a moment, the grass damp beneath his boots, and looks up at the vast, star-strewn sky. The same stars that looked down upon the fog of Austerlitz now shine over an empire that spans nearly the entire continent. It is a moment of profound, solitary quiet. the zenith of a climb that began on a small island far to the south. The weight of the world is heavy, but in this stillness it feels manageable, a task that he was born to complete. He returns to his narrow bed, the green silk curtains closing out the world, and as he drifts into a shallow, restorative sleep, the map of his empire remains spread out upon the desk, its lines sharp and clear in the fading light of the ember. The reorganization of the world is well underway, and for now the master of Europe finds rest in the order he has created. The ink on the maps is barely dry before a new ambition begins to stir, a quiet tension that pulls the gaze of the emperor away from the sun-drenched plains of the south and toward the vast, cooling shadows of the north. It is the year 1812, and a subtle shift has occurred in the winds of diplomacy, a cooling of the friendship once sworn on a raft in the middle of a river. The Russian frontier beckons, not with the promise of easy conquest, but with the gravity of a final challenge, a necessity to secure the edges of a world that Napoleon has spent a lifetime stitching together. Imagine the sound of 500,000 boots, the rhythmic, heavy thrum of the Grande Armée as it assembles along the banks of the Niemen River. It is the largest force the world has ever seen, a tapestry of nations woven into a single blue-clad machine. There is a specific smell to such a gathering, the scent of oiled leather, the metallic tang of polished muskets, and the earthy musk of thousands of horses grazing on the summer grass. As the sun dips below the horizon, on the 24th of June, the first pontoon bridges are laid across the water. The crossing is a slow, steady pulse, a river of humanity flowing into the vastness of the Russian interior. The air is warm, the days are long, and for a moment the enterprise feels blessed by the same fortune that has followed the emperor since the bridge at Lodi. But as the army moves deeper into the land, a strange, unsettling quiet begins to descend. The Russian landscape is an ocean of green and gold, an endless expanse of birch forests and rye fields that seem to swallow the sound of the marching columns. Unlike the crowded heart of Europe, where every hill holds a village and every valley a town, this land is defiant in its emptiness. The enemy does not stand and fight, they simply recede like a tide pulling back before a storm. As the soldiers march, they find only blackened remains where storehouses once stood and empty wells where water should have been. The heat of the Russian summer becomes a heavy, suffocating blanket, and the dust kicked up by the cavalry hangs in the air like a golden fog, coating the throats of the men and the manes of the horses. Napoleon watches from his saddle, his eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the one decisive battle that will bring the Tsar to his knees. Days turn into weeks, and the miles stretch out into hundreds. The rhythm of the march becomes a hypnotic, wearying cycle of sunrise and sunset. At night, the campfires dot the plains like fallen stars, but the laughter of the earlier campaigns has grown hushed, replaced by the crackle of burning brush and the low murmur of men wondering how far the world can truly go. Then, the city of Moscow appears, a shimmering vision of gilded domes and emerald spires rising out of the plains like a mirage. It is the holy city, the heart of old Russia, and as the French vanguard enters the gates in September, they expect to find the keys to the empire waiting for them. Instead, they find a ghost. Moscow is hollow, its streets echoing with the lonely sound of their own footsteps. The grand palaces are silent, their silk curtains fluttering in the breeze of open windows, their tables set for meals that will never be eaten. It is an eerie, unsettling victory. Napoleon takes up residence in the Kremlin, pacing the stone floors of the ancient fortress, waiting for a messenger of peace that never arrives. And then, in the middle of a moonless night, the first plumes of smoke begin to rise. The city is burning.
What began as a few scattered fires soon becomes a roaring sea of flame, turning the night sky into a bruised purple and orange. The heat is so intense that the lead on the roofs of the cathedrals begins to melt, dripping like silver tears onto the cobblestones. For 4 days, the emperor watches his prize turn to ash, the flickering light reflecting in his eyes as he realizes that the rules of war have changed. The silence of the north is not a sign of surrender, but a vow of defiance. The decision to retreat is made with a heavy heart, just as the first breath of autumn begins to turn the leaves to brittle gold. The departure from Moscow is a slow, burdened procession, the wagons loaded with spoils that will soon become a deadly weight.
As the army turns its back on the blackened ruins, the sky begins to change. The vibrant blues of summer fade into a pale, translucent grey, and a biting wind begins to whistle through the rye. Then comes the snow. It does not arrive with a roar, but with a gentle, rhythmic dusting, a soft white veil that settles on the shoulders of the men and the hats of the horses. At first, it is beautiful, a silent transformation of the world into a landscape of marble and lace. But the cold is a patient predator. It seeps through the wool of the overcoats and numbs the fingers until the grip on a musket becomes a chore of pure will. The retreat becomes a story of endurance, a long white corridor of time where the only sound is the rhythmic crunch of boots on frozen crust. Each step is a struggle against the gravity of exhaustion. The nights are the hardest, as the temperature plummets and the fires struggle to burn against the damp wood. Men huddle together for warmth, their breath blooming in the air like small fading ghosts. Napoleon himself walks among them, his fur-lined cloak heavy with the weight of the frost, his face set in a mask of grim determination. He is no longer the young conqueror of Italy. He is a man witnessing the limits of human ambition against the indifferent power of the elements. The crossing of the Berezina River stands as a testament to the flickering embers of the Grand Armée's spirit. Under the shadow of the Russian pursuit, engineers work in chest-deep icy water to build bridges that allow the remnants of the force to escape. It is a moment of profound sorrow and incredible bravery, a bridge between the dream of empire and the reality of survival. As the survivors finally cross back over the Niemen, the once mighty host has been reduced to a shadow of its former self. The horses are gone, the cannons abandoned in the drifts, and the faces of the men are etched with the sights of a winter that lasted a lifetime. The news of the disaster ripples across the continent like a crack in a frozen lake. The aura of invincibility that had shielded Napoleon for nearly 2 decades begins to shatter. In the courts of Berlin, Vienna, and London, the tides of alliance begin to shift. The nations that had once bowed to the French eagle now see the feathers ruffled by the northern frost. They begin to stir, to whisper, and to gather their own strength. The map of Europe, once so clearly defined by the emperor's pen, begins to blur at the edges. Yet even in the face of such a catastrophic loss, the spirit of the man remains unyielding. Back in Paris, he works by the light of a single candle, raising new armies from the very soil of France, drawing on the last reserves of a nation that has given him everything. The shadows of the north have followed him home, lengthening across the gardens of the Tuileries, but for Napoleon, the story is not yet over. There is still a rhythm to the march, still a flicker of the old fire in the hearth, and as he prepares for the final defence of his throne, he finds a strange, quiet peace in the certainty of the struggle. The world is changing, the alliances are hardening, and the long winter of the empire has only just begun. The scent of rosemary and wild thyme drifts across the rocky hills of Elba, carried by a warm Mediterranean breeze that whispers of home, yet feels like a cage. For 10 months, the man who once commanded the fate of millions has played at being a king in miniature. overseeing the construction of roads and the harvest of salt on his tiny island domain. But as the winter of 1815 begins to soften into spring, the smallness of the horizon becomes unbearable. On a moonless night, the 26th of February, a small flotilla slips quietly away from the harbour of Portoferraio. Napoleon stands upon the deck of the brig Inconstant, his eyes fixed toward the north, toward the coast of France, while the rhythmic creak of the timber and the gentle splashing of the waves provide the only soundtrack to a gamble that will stun the world. The landing at Golfe Juan is not marked by the thunder of cannons, but by the soft crunch of gravel underfoot and the smell of pine needles. This is the beginning of what history will call the flight of the eagle, a journey that feels less like a military invasion and more like a dream unfolding in the waking world. As he marches northward through the rugged mountains of the Alps, the air is crisp and thin, and the silence of the valleys is broken only by the steady tramp of a few hundred loyal boots. Near the town of Laffrey, a wall of royalist soldiers stands across the road, their muskets levelled, their faces pale with a mixture of duty and dread. Napoleon steps forward alone, his grey overcoat a familiar silhouette against the greenery. He baring his chest to them, his voice steady and calm as he tells them that if they wish to kill their emperor, here he is. In that moment, the tension snaps like a dry twig. The soldiers break ranks, not to attack, but to embrace him, their cries of "Long live the Emperor" echoing through the mountain passes and rolling down toward the heart of France. The march to Paris becomes a slow, inevitable tide, a procession of flowers and cheers that gathers strength with every league. By the time he reaches the Tuileries Palace on the 20th of March, the Bourbon king has fled into the night, and Napoleon is carried up the grand staircase on the shoulders of a jubilant crowd, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and old silk. But this homecoming is shadowed by the knowledge that the rest of Europe is already arming itself. The peace he offers is rejected. The great powers declare not war on France, but war on the man himself. And so, the rhythm of the drum begins again, a low, pulsing heartbeat that draws him toward the north, toward the rolling hills and sunken lanes of the Belgian countryside. The atmosphere in the days leading up to the 18th of June is heavy, saturated with a dampness that clings to the skin. The skies over the fields of Waterloo are not bright with the promise of glory, but bruised with purple clouds and a relentless, soaking rain that turns the earth into a thick, clinging mire. Napoleon sits in a small farmhouse, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across his maps, while outside the mud swallows the wheels of the heavy cannons. The ground is too soft for the cavalry to charge, too slick for the infantry to find their footing. He must wait for the sun to dry the earth, a delay of hours that feels like grains of sand slipping through a broken hourglass. The air is thick with the smell of wet wool, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of approaching storm. As the battle finally joins, the landscape is transformed into a chaotic symphony of sound and smoke. The roar of the grand battery shakes the very foundations of the earth, a rhythmic thudding that vibrates in the chest of every man standing in the tall rye. Through the spyglass, the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean appears as a wall of red and grey, obscured by the white plumes of musket fire. The afternoon wears on in a slow, brutal grind, the air growing heavy with the acrid scent of burnt gunpowder and the steam rising from the horses' flanks. There is a strange, terrible beauty in the sight of the French cavalry, thousands of steel breastplates shimmering in a sudden burst of sunlight as they surge up the slope, a silver wave breaking against the solid squares of the British infantry. But the mud remains, a silent, stubborn enemy that drags at the feet and slows the momentum of the charge. When the sun begins to set, casting long golden fingers across the trampled fields, the arrival of the Prussian army on the flank signals the end of the dream. The old guard, the men who have stood by him from the sun of Austerlitz to the snows of Russia, form their final squares in the deepening gloom. They are a forest of bearskin hats and bayonets, standing firm amidst the retreating tide, a testament to a world that is rapidly fading away. Napoleon watches from the heights, his face a mask of weary calm, as the realization settles over him like the evening mist. The era of the empire is not merely ending, it is dissolving into the twilight. The retreat is not a panic, but a slow, somber withdrawal through the darkness, the stars beginning to peek through the breaking clouds over a landscape that has been forever changed. Returning to Paris, the air in the city feels different, thinner, colder, stripped of the electric energy of the spring. The halls of the Élysée Palace are quiet, the only sound the scratching of a pen as he signs his second abdication. He thinks of his son, the small boy he will never see again, and of the vast, complicated legacy he leaves behind. There is no grand final speech, no dramatic gesture to the heavens. Instead, there is a quiet journey toward the coast, toward the salt spray of the Atlantic and the port of Rochefort. He walks along the shoreline, the wind tugging at his hat, looking out at the grey, churning waters that represent both an escape and a finality. On the 15th of July, the Emperor of the French boards the HMS Bellerophon, a British ship of the line. As he climbs the wooden steps, he is no longer a conqueror or a fugitive, but a guest of his most persistent enemies. The sailors watch him with a silent, respectful curiosity. This man who has dominated their thoughts and their lives for 2 decades. The ship weighs anchor, the white sails unfurling like the wings of a great bird, and as the coast of France begins to slip away into the morning haze, Napoleon stands at the stern. He watches the familiar cliffs of his adopted home fade from green to grey, and then to a faint, shimmering line on the horizon. The deck beneath his feet is steady, the rhythm of the sea a constant, soothing pulse that carries him away from the noise of history and toward the profound silence of the deep ocean. The Napoleonic era has ended, not with a bang, but with the soft creaking of ropes and the endless, rhythmic sighing of the waves against the hull. The scent of damp earth and salt spray hangs heavy in the air of the South Atlantic, a sharp contrast to the dry dust of the Egyptian desert or the crisp, wintry chill of the Russian plains. On this remote volcanic outcrop, thousands of miles from the nearest continent, the world has shrunk to the size of a single estate called Longwood. It is a place where the clouds do not merely pass overhead, but often settle directly onto the ground, wrapping the house in a soft grey shroud of mist that muffles the sound of the wind and turns the trees into ghostly silhouettes. Here, at the edge of the known world, the man who once redrew the maps of Europe lives out his final years in a quiet, measured rhythm, far removed from the thundering hooves of the cavalry and the roar of the cannons. Longwood House sits atop a wind-swept plateau, a modest collection of rooms that once served as a farm. The walls are thin, and the Atlantic gales often rattle the shutters, but inside a different kind of history is being forged. Napoleon has traded his sword for a pen, or more accurately, for the voices of his loyal companions who sit by his side, scribbling furiously as he paces the floor. He dictates his memoirs for hours on end, his voice steady and low, weaving a tapestry of memories that stretches back to the sun-drenched hills of Corsica and the narrow streets of Paris. He speaks of the bridge at Lodi, the golden sun rising over Austerlitz, and the bitter, freezing winds of the retreat from Moscow. It is as if by speaking these names he can keep the flame of his legacy burning bright against the encroaching fog of the island. As the years pass, the grand ambitions of empire begin to soften, replaced by the simple, meditative tasks of the garden. The man who once commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers now finds a strange, quiet peace in the soil. He spends his mornings planning elaborate flower beds and supervising the construction of sunken paths and turf walls designed to shield his private walks from the prying eyes of the British sentries who watch from the ridges. There is a gentle irony in seeing those hands, which once held the sceptre of France, now covered in the dark, rich earth of St. Helena. He plants roses and willow trees, watching them take root in the volcanic soil, their slow growth a testament to a different kind of endurance. The garden becomes a sanctuary, a small patch of order and beauty in a world that has grown increasingly small and silent. In the quiet hours of the evening, when the mist presses against the windows and the candles flicker in their holders, his thoughts often drift toward the people who defined his life. He speaks of his son, the King of Rome, whom he will never see again, and wonders what kind of man he will become in the gilded cage of the Austrian court. But more often than not, his reflections return to Josephine. Despite the years of separation and the political necessities that drove them apart, her name remains a constant refrain in his heart. He remembers the way she laughed, the scent of her favourite violets, and the grace with which she moved through the halls of Malmaison. In the stillness of Longwood, the complexities of power and the demands of the state fade away, leaving only the raw, enduring memory of a love that survived the heights of glory and the depths of exile. The nature of power itself becomes a frequent subject of his late-night contemplations. He muses on the fragility of thrones and the fickle nature of the masses, realizing that the true measure of a man is not found in the titles he wears or the territories he conquers, but in the ideas he leaves behind. He speaks of the Napoleonic Code, the laws he crafted to bring order and equality to a chaotic world, and he takes comfort in the belief that these words will outlast his physical presence. The empire of the mind, he realizes, is far more resilient than any empire of stone and steel. As he speaks, his breathing becomes slower, more rhythmic, mirroring the steady pulse of the ocean that surrounds him on all sides. As 1821 arrives, a profound weariness begins to settle over him. The illness that has been lingering in the shadows of his health grows more insistent, and the long walks in the garden become shorter and less frequent. He spends more time reclining on his sofa, draped in his old military cloak, listening to the rain drum against the roof. The world outside continues its slow, indifferent rotation, but inside the darkened rooms of Longwood, time seems to stretch and thin, like a piece of silk pulled taut. He is no longer the emperor, no longer the general, but a man coming to terms with the finitude of his own existence. The final days are marked by a deep, contemplative silence. He is surrounded by a few faithful friends who have stayed with him until the end, their presence a source of quiet strength. He asks for the windows to be opened so he can hear the birds in the garden, and the distant, rhythmic sighing of the Atlantic waves. The sound is a constant, a lullaby that has played through every moment of his exile, reminding him of the vastness of the world and the smallness of a single life. He feels the weight of history lifting from his shoulders, replaced by a lightness, a sense of drifting away on a calm, outgoing tide. In the early evening of the 5th of May, as the sun begins to dip below the horizon and the first stars appear in the darkening sky, the long journey that began in the Mediterranean finally reaches its conclusion. The room is still, save for the soft ticking of a clock and the gentle rustle of the wind in the trees outside. His last words are whispered into the shadows, a final tribute to the army, the country, and the woman he loved. And then there is only the silence. He is laid to rest in a quiet valley on the island, beneath the shade of the willow trees he helped to plant. The spot is simple, marked by a plain stone without an inscription, as if the island itself is holding its breath, honouring the man who once shook the foundations of the world. The grass grows tall around the grave, swaying in the breeze, and the birds continue to sing in the branches above. It is a place of profound peace, far from the noise of the crowds and the clamour of the battlefield. Decades later, his remains would be returned to France to rest beneath the great dome of Les Invalides in Paris, but the spirit of those final years remains forever tied to the lonely cliffs of St. Helena. The island stands as a monument to the quietude of the end, a reminder that even the most epic of stories eventually finds its way to a peaceful conclusion. The ocean continues its eternal work, the waves rolling in from the deep, washing against the dark rocks and retreating back to the blue expanse over and over again. The mist rolls in from the sea, blanketing the plateau of Longwood in a soft white veil. The garden sleeps, the roses bowing their heads under the weight of the dew, and the paths he once walked are reclaimed by the slow, steady growth of the earth. Everything is still. The stars above are bright and cold, watching over the silent island as it floats in the vast darkness of the Atlantic. There is no more struggle, no more ambition, only the infinite, soothing rhythm of the waves. As you drift towards sleep, imagine that same rhythmic pulse of the ocean. Feel the coolness of the mist on your skin and the absolute stillness of the night air. The world is vast, and you are safe within its embrace, carried along by the same gentle current that guided the emperor home. The history of the world is a long, winding river, and now it has reached the sea. The water is calm, the surface like glass, reflecting the light of 1,000 distant suns. Rest now, as the shadows lengthen and the light fades to a soft charcoal grey. The story is told, the journey is complete, and the silence of the deep ocean is waiting to welcome you. Let the sound of the waves be your guide, pulling you deeper into the quiet, into the dreamless sleep that waits at the end of all things. The Atlantic sighs, the wind whispers through the willows, and the world turns slowly, peacefully into the night.